Rome, one of the greatest empires of all time, and also one of the most heavily documented. Much of Rome's conquests and histories have been pored over by historians and 7th grade history students alike. And one would be hard-pressed to find someone who has not heard of Rome, outside of perhaps uncontacted tribes in the Amazon or the North Sentinelese. But not all of Rome's history is as documented as its great leaders and conquests. There are many mysteries still surrounding the initial foundation of Rome and the process by which it changed from a small village to a Mediterranean-wide empire. In this video, I hope to shed some light on this early Roman history and the myths that surround it. The foundation of Rome is one of two stories, the one of fact and the one of legend. The one that the Romans want you to believe, and the one that is true. They're similar in some places and differ wildly in others. We'll look at both of these histories in order to better understand not only what was factual about the creation of this empire, but also how they saw themselves develop. Now, before we get into the meat and potatoes of the founding of Rome, I need to share a quick disclaimer. I'm not a professional historian. I'm a college student who's juggled 4 books trying to make this video while maintaining a full course load. I may miss something or get lost in the sauce a little bit and get confused somewhere. If I do miss something, please don't hesitate to let me know in the comments below. To learn about the foundation of Rome, we must first learn about Italy. Ancient Italy was an incredibly diverse part of the world, ranging from the Alpines to the plains. Fertile areas of Italy were interspersed with mountains and difficult terrain. It was also a land of many peoples. We unfortunately lack the ability to accurately define these peoples, but ancients referred to it as a land of different tribes. Some ethnicities were prescribed to the area, but whether the people there at this time would self-identify with them is unclear. It's more likely that the people of this time period had a much larger affiliation to their family and community than any ethnic label. The area of the initial founding of Rome is in hilly terrain alongside the Tiber River, with an island in the Tiber nearby affording the opportunity for easy crossings, and the hills provided many defensible locations. Archaeological evidence tells us that the site of what became Rome consisted of a few settlements across these hills in the Middle Bronze Age. The precise relationship between these settlements is still unclear to this day, but we do have some good ideas of the process that formed these settlements into Rome. This is a picture that was seen often across Latium at this time. It was dotted with many small clusters of settlements such as this one, and we may never know what made this group in particular successful, but its impact would shape history for centuries to come. One main settlement that may eventually become the city of Rome is built on the Palatine Hill. The earliest remains of what would become Rome date back to the 10th century, although human occupation of this area goes back at least 5,000 years. This settlement was rather ordinary, made of primarily oval wooden huts with thatched roofs of varying sizes, some as big as 8 by 12 meters. That's big enough for a small, toga-wearing frat party. Parts of this village, including what was supposedly the home of the legendary figure Romulus, were dutifully preserved for many decades by the Roman people, reconstructing it through fire and natural disaster as sacred monuments in their creation story. There are also surrounding settlements on the Quirinal, Viminal, Salian, Oppian, and Velia. However, due to the focus on the Palatine because of Roman mythology, it's important to remember that we may not have a full picture of what this area may have looked like. It's entirely likely that if archaeological efforts had been focused elsewhere, we may have seen another hill as the impetus of Rome. During excavations conducted by Giacomo Boni from 1902 to 1905, discoveries shed light on the early utilization of what would later become the Roman Forum. Evidence emerged indicating that during this period the site served as a cemetery. Boni unearthed 41 graves containing both cremation and inhumation burials, indicating diverse burial practices prevalent among ancient inhabitants, likely originating from the Palatine and/or the Capitoline Hills. These burial customs were emblematic of early Latium, with cremation being a predominant method. Corpses were typically incinerated, placed within sizable earthenware jars, and placed into slots cut in the earth before being covered with a capstone. Although less common, inhumation burials were also present, highlighting some of the varying practices of burial during this time period. We do not exactly know what differentiated these two types of burials. It could have been that certain leaders were given inhumation burials, or the different practices of two neighboring communities. This is yet another place that the exact context of the history may have been lost to time. Moving forward to the 8th century, significant developments marked the evolution of settlements into more organized towns. Notably, the construction of the first walls around the city represent a pivotal moment in urban development. These walls, situated around the northern foot of the Palatine, were constructed using a combination of stone and earth for the foundation, with a superstructure of clay and wood on top. The placement of this wall on the north, rather in a more strategic and defensible position near the crest of the hill, and narrow dimensions of just over 3 feet wide, suggest it not only served as a defensive position, but also a way to mark the edge of the settlement at that time. This type of border demarcation was an important moment in the transition between a settlement and a small town. The excavation of this wall helps give us a better picture of the size of the settlement during that period. The evolution of Rome up unto the 8th century is similar to that of other settlements in Latium, with the now small city occupying multiple hills instead of one, possibly homologating with other settlements around it, with the most sizable of these settled areas being on the Palatine and the Capitoline, although there is evidence of occupation at this time of other hills, like the Quirinal. There is also further evidence that shows people organizing and creating areas of congregation, as the Forum had been abandoned as a cemetery and was now used as a public space. It was paved over, and there's early evidence of the Comitium, the area which the Roman assembly met, and the Vulcanal, the shrine of Vulcan. There are also houses on the future sites of the House of the Vestals and the Domus Publica, further showing the transformation of the Forum into a public and community space. This is solid evidence that this area has further begun to centralize. Early Roman religion can tell us more about this time period as well. One group, called the Salii, also known as the Leaping Priests, who would perform in ceremonies that took place to mark the end of the year in February, were divided into two groups, Salii Palantini and Salii Collini, the former representing the Palatine and the latter representing the Quirinal. Additionally to this, the celebration known as the Septimonium has been interpreted as a sign of religious unification. The Septimonium took place on December 11th, which is close to the time to begin planting crops for the next year, meaning it could be meant to celebrate the beginning of that year's agricultural work. Some early Roman scholars even stated that, quote, Septimonium was the name of Rome before it became Rome, end quote. Additionally, in this event, the hills Quirinal and Viminal are absent from the list of participants, and are also referred to as colles rather than the more common term montes. Could this possibly denote some cultural or linguistic difference with these two hills? We may never know. Looking forward in time, by the end of the 8th century, Rome had entrenched itself in a proto-urban state, occupying multiple hills with defenses and places for public activity, built mostly of wood and clay huts. The edges of these hills had defenses and walls, and areas like the Forum for public and community. The presence of separate cemeteries at this time may indicate that different initial villages had held a degree of separation from one another, with allegiance to family and community still strong, but it was well on its way to the first stages of a city-state. The legend of the founding of Rome is far more well known than the actual historical record. This does not make it any less important, however, as it can tell us much about how the Romans viewed themselves, and sets the scene for the future of the Roman Empire. The legend of Rome begins with the legend of Troy. And yes, the Troy with the horse, which is frankly deserving a video all of its own. But the cliff notes are, once upon a time, in the ancient land of Troy, a bunch of beefy Greeks armed to the teeth decided they want a pretty face named Helen. But oops, she's already married to some Trojan dude. Cue the epic saga of a wooden horse that makes IKEA furniture look simple, sneaky Greeks hiding inside it, and a city that learns the hard way not to accept surprise gifts. The city of Troy was ransacked, and the survivors, led by a man named Aeneas, were left to sail off dejectedly into the sunset. After a couple filler episodes, the Trojan refugees made their way to West Italy and the Tiber, where they disembarked. Here they met Latinus, an old king of Latini, a tribe living between the Tiber and the Anio rivers. His people were of Greek origin, and his daughter was promised to marry a local chief of the Rhelian tribe. Upon arrival of the Trojans, however, he gave his daughter to Aeneas instead. Conflict quickly followed, and Aeneas bested the chief Turnus in combat. and he founded the city Lavinium, named after his wife. Then followed another great conflict with the Rhodians, after which Aeneas vanished and was never seen again. It was believed by many ancient historians that he was taken by the gods. 300 years later, and the line of Aeneas gave birth to 2 boys in the town of Alba Longa, sons of the war god Mars, born to a priestess with an oath to live as a virgin, and a daughter to the former king Numitor. Now exactly how do you attract the attention of a war god as a priestess? I don't quite know. But anyway, the children were taken and meant to be killed by being left in a basket floating down the Tiber. However, they were found and nursed by a she-wolf, and eventually brought in by a local shepherd, Faustulus. They grew up not knowing of their true identities. When the brothers were 18, they became involved in an altercation with herdsmen of the king Emilius, who had usurped the throne from the former king and his brother Numitor, eventually getting into a brawl and badly injuring some of the men loyal to Numitor. These men then decided to arrest the brothers and hand them over to authorities. On the day of a festival to honor the god of shepherds, a ritual was to take place, wherein the boys of the village would run around the Palatine Hill in nothing but loincloths and strike at bystanders with leather thongs. This ritual was to cleanse the flock and invite human fertility. Romulus and Remus took part in this ceremony, with Remus at the head, and at the back, Romulus was carrying the rear. The angry forces of Numitor lay in wait, and as Remus and the first boys approached, they jumped out and took them prisoner. As Romulus was at the end, he was able to escape and avoid capture, and began to gather a group to rescue his brother. Remus and the other boys were brought before the king, who allowed Numitor to decide his punishment. This was when Numitor became suspicious of Remus, believing him to be one of his daughter's lost sons. He asked Remus, as he was led away, who his parents were. Remus responded that he did not know, and that he and his brother were found by a herdsman in the countryside as babies. Then Numitor asked Remus, quote, "If I free you, would you be willing to help me in a project that could be to our mutual benefit?" End quote. Numitor then explains how his brother had stolen the throne from him, and asked Remus to help him take it back. Remus agreed, and he sent word to Romulus to come help as soon as he could. At the same time, Faustulus, the herdsman that had originally found and raised the boys, feared that they would not believe Remus. So he brought the basket he found them in originally into the city, to use as proof Remus was telling the truth. By chance, the man that had originally discarded the boys saw the basket, and reported Faustulus to the king. He was quickly taken in to explain himself directly to the king. Acting in possibly the most obvious facade of all time, the king warmly asked where the boys were, so that he could give them a welcome at the palace. The shepherds said they had been watching the flocks, and the king sent out men to kill them. Word got to Numitor that the jig was up, and the boys and their compatriots were able to force their way into the town and kill King Emilius, returning the throne to Numitor. With Alba Longa rightfully returned, the question arose what to do with Romulus and Remus. Well, Alba Longa was a quickly growing town, and enough headstrong people were ready to leave and found a new city. These people would be led by the brothers. They chose the hills where they were first abandoned along the Tiber as the location for their new city, and decided to fortify one of those hills. However, they could not agree on which one to choose. Romulus preferred the Palatine, whereas Remus believed the adjacent Avetine was a better choice. In order to settle the dispute, they made a sacrifice to the gods, and each stood on their respective hills to watch for flights of birds, the contemporary way to tell the divine will. Remus saw 6 vultures take flight past his hill. Romulus, however, lied and said he had seen a flight of 12 vultures. Remus believed that he had won because he had seen the birds first, whereas Romulus believed he had won because he had supposedly seen the most birds. In the end, the matter was still undecided. Romulus began to build the walls of his city nonetheless. Remus, mockingly, leaped over one of these walls, throwing his brother into a fit of rage. A conflict ensued, and Remus was killed by Romulus or one of his supporters. Romulus, filled with grief and remorse, lost all ambition for a time, but when it returned, he finished building his city and named it Rome. Romulus then ruled as king of Rome for the next 37 years, tackling challenges such as maintaining Rome's population and laying the groundwork for a future city. After the 37 years, he disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Once again, it's believed by the Roman people that he was taken by the gods. If I had a nickel for every time someone was taken by the gods in this story, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't that much, but it's weird that it happened twice. Do keep in mind that this is just one way this story is told. Ancient accounts differ wildly on the nuances of this story, but the themes remain the same. These themes are incredibly important as we look into the future of Rome, as the myth gives us a good example of how the early Romans saw themselves. The importance of strength and self-reliance, as well as the importance of expansion and military valor. On top of this, it sets the stage for the Romans' penchant for killing each other over political disagreements. I find both the true story and the legend of the foundation of Rome incredibly interesting, and we can learn much about Rome from both of these accounts, especially about a time in history that is less documented than some others. If I missed anything or got anything wrong, please let me know. Sources are linked in my website. Thanks for watching.